Good morning, Katie.
Okay. Welcome to Species Among Us. It did occur to me that it sounds kind of like an X-Files episode, but is in fact about life on Earth, which it turns out is just as weird and cool as actual science fiction. This talk is in a series for a year-long celebration of Women of the Explorers Club, featuring different lectures every month, spanning pretty much everywhere and every scientific discipline. All right. Well, my name is Katie Bossler, and I am a recent graduate of a sustainability program at Columbia University. I also work as an investigative environmental journalist, but probably the two most important things you should know about me are I'm obsessed with snails, and I recently learned how to milk goats, which it turns out is a lot more challenging than you would think. I'm so excited for the scientists who are joining us today because they have dedicated their lives to discovering species and to understanding ways to protect them. I want to start with like a quick high school biology overview refresher of what biodiversity is. So essentially, biodiversity is all species, their habitats, and their genetic diversity. The genetic diversity is really important because as environmental conditions change, species need to be able to adapt because of things like climate change, you might have heard of it, and also things like disease. And it's still mind blowing to me that we've described over 1 million species to science, but we're still discovering new ones. You might have heard this expression that God loves beetles. And that is because a quarter of all animals on the planet are, in fact, beetles. This is a bunch of fireflies hanging out, talking to each other through light in the air. And I love it because it's just this like beautiful display and they're just lighting up this ecosystem. And to me, it really brings home that biodiversity is the glue that holds ecosystems together. If you randomly start removing them, just like parts of a computer, eventually the ecosystems are going to crash. And the ecosystems in our world really need our attention and repair right now.
Katie, just a heads up, we can't see your screen.
Cannot see it?
Nope.
Oh. Okay.
Just wanted to make sure with the fireflies sounding so lovely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hang on. Let me start here though, because these are pretty awesome photos. I'm so sorry you couldn't see them. Okay. Are you seeing it now?
Perfect.
Okay, cool. All right. So here you go. Here's me attempting to make contact with a snail. Here's me proving that I did, in fact, learn how to milk a goat. And then this beautiful photo that Mai provided. So thank you to all of our speakers for being here. Okay, biodiversity, all species, their habitats and genetics. This chart just really bringing home, how many that we've already been able to describe and how many more are out there for us to still learn about. Here are the beautiful fireflies communicating with one another, and then this, pretty shocking statistic, which is, a reason I think that we're all in this field and here today, just really passionate about figuring out what we can do to help repair our ecosystems. One of my favorite things to do is to map biodiversity. And I do this pretty much everywhere in my backyard. And I've been lucky enough, thanks to Dr. Julie Kunin, who we're going to hear from in a little bit, who through her mentorship and friendship has helped me to do this in protected areas around the world. A couple of summers ago, I was able to spend time in the Bolivian rainforest, and I was studying occupancy with a team of researchers. This was a jaguar print that we found near base camp on our first night. So we were looking for tracks as well as setting camera traps. So I can't talk about biodiversity without, of course, showing some charismatic megafauna. This jaguar is beautiful, and some of the local scientists actually can tell them apart just based on their rosette patterns. This is an ocelot. I know they're adorable, but you definitely want to give them their space. And this was an armadillo who would come through our camp every night looking for some food. And the thing about going through camera trap photos, probably every biologist has had this experience, is you do see a lot of butt photos. I guess this would be as good a time as any to thank Fial Raven, who is a club sponsor and provided me with the Young Explorers grant to be able to do this work in Bolivia. I promise I was doing more than just kissing snails and taking pictures of animal butts. And because I have a captive audience right now, I want to show you a picture of one of my favorite animals on planet Earth. This is a naked mole rat. It reminds me of the fact that we ourselves evolved from a shrew-like rodent over the course of 65 million years. And if the dinosaurs hadn't have gotten so unlucky, we might all still be snacks ourselves. So it's pretty humbling. All right, let's talk about the fun stuff. So why are we losing biodiversity? Well, first off, we're not really losing it. It's not like it's just like lost waiting somewhere for us to find it. It's being systematically destroyed. And there are lots of reasons for this, like we see here when we break it down. But really, the big picture is that our governments and our corporations, for the most part, depend on systematic destruction and are based on ecological abuse, and changing the way these systems work is absolutely paramount. Ecologist Carl Safina recently wrote an article for Yale 360 entitled "Avoiding a Ghastly Future: Hard Truths on the State of the Planet." He invites us, so I will invite you all to put on your shower cap and step into the cold. I'm going to read from the article. You might want to grab a glass of wine or maybe cry some blood tears along the way. These are some pretty harsh statistics, but I think it's necessary to frame where we're at and what the stakes are. Humans have altered about 70% of Earth's land surface and ocean. Wetlands have lost 85% of their natural area. Kelp forests have lost 40%. Seagrass meadows are disappearing at 1% per year. The ocean's large predatory fish are 2/3 gone. Coral reefs have lost half their living mass. Agriculture has halved the weight of living vegetation on land, driving a diversity loss of 20%. 40% of extinct plants are currently endangered. Farmed animals and humans now constitute 96% of all land animals. Only about 5% are wild, free-living animals. The world's wild populations of birds, mammals, fishes, reptiles, and amphibians have declined by an average of nearly 70% in just the last 50 years, a breathtaking plummet. More than 700 vertebrate species have gone extinct over the last 500 years, an extinction rate 15 times the natural rate. Around 1 million species are now threatened with total extinction. These disruptions and declines have caused the deterioration of soil, air, and water quality, pollination, carbon sequestration, and human health. Other things have increased: floods, fires, the number of malnourished people, plastic pollution, general toxification, and infectious epidemics. All right, how's everyone doing after that? He does offer some sage advice. He says that the point of seeing existential threats is not necessarily to face the doomsday future, but to avert one. There are ways of life that don't depend on systematic destruction. According to the United Nations, 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by indigenous communities, and securing land rights for them is a vital part of conservation efforts. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about that later. More than ever, the millions of species we share this planet with require our action to protect them. And the scientists with us today have all risen to that urgent calling in different and important ways. We will go into the trees with canopy ecologist, Dr. Beg Lauman. And then we will go into where our food comes from and solutions associated with transforming our agriculture systems with anthropologist and journalist, Dr. Julie Kunin. Biologist Mai Fami will take us in the bellies of leeches. She still remains the only person I know who actively seeks leeches out. Her work will show us the importance of understanding genetic diversity and teach us about some of the tools to do this. And finally, Dr. Paige West, an anthropologist and political ecologist who has worked closely with indigenous and traditional communities around the world to understand their relationships to their land bases and what governance structures and traditions allow for living in balance with our ecosystems. So please put your questions in the comments and we'll get to them at the end. And I want to thank Meg for starting us off. She's joining us from Scotland, where it's past midnight right now. So a huge thank you. And I know we're interrupting your sleep schedule, so it's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and then just give you a bit more on Meg. So over the past 40 years, Dr. Meg Lauman's work in forest canopy science involved groundbreaking work in 46 countries in all 7 continents. She's co-chaired 5 international canopy conferences and authored over 150 scientific publications and 9 books on forest science and sustainability. She actively pursues bottom-up conservation activities, including community initiatives for schools, corporations, and teams to manage local resources more sustainably. Thank you so much, Meg.
Hey, thank you. It's lovely to be here, even if it is the middle of the night, and it's really fun to talk about a few minutes, and I can't wait to share this stage with all the wonderful women on this program, so thanks. So I will start with forests and the biodiversity there. My title reflects a book that I just published about 2 weeks ago, so I'm really excited to be sharing my stories as a woman in science, hopefully with other girls as well as boys around the world. So many of us in the Explorers Club and in the scientific world started out as those geek kids that collected a lot of things. I was definitely one of those with my wildflowers and my snake skins and my rocks and my bird's nests. And so I guess I give a lot of credit to playing outdoors as a child in those days before internet, I must admit, and the fact that we could all play in nature, which is a huge part of my interest in exploration and biodiversity. So I encourage everybody to take a kid outdoors at some point in time. So my childhood play led me to climb trees as a kid and now as a big kid. And so I have had the privilege of traveling around the world and becoming one of the world's first arbonauts. Whereas Kathy Sullivan is an astronaut, explores outer space, I am an arbonaut and explore the treetops. And it's been a wonderful journey, but sobering information, of course, has been collected about the demise of so many of the world's forests. We do know now that about half of the land-based biodiversity lives in the tops of trees. We also know that only 10% or less has been classified by scientists. So this is a clarion call for all young people to please grow up and become arbonauts so that we can really tackle all of this biodiversity together. My own life, which is summarized in the book. So if you want to sip your wine and forget about the talk, you can read the book later. Started some 40 plus years ago when I first sewed my harness and welded a slingshot in Sydney, Australia as a graduate student, and ended up climbing trees and discovering all sorts of things living at the top. It was a wild and wonderful journey, and it led me to move on and build canopy walkways as a second tool for arbonauts, because sometimes I wanted to take other volunteers or students into the treetops with me. And in addition to that, we ended up with a group of cranes around the world to explore specific forests, mostly in the tropics, but not entirely. And I came back to the States from a long and wonderful career in Australia to end up building the first walkway in North America in my college campus up in Massachusetts, in those temperate forests that we think we know everything about, but we really don't know much at all.
Meg, I'm sorry to interrupt. We are having the same problem with you. We can't see your screen. I think there are some ghosts haunting us right now, and playing tricks. But yeah.
So do I have a screen share option? Hopefully somewhere we can fix that up. And maybe if you want to tell me how I can get that to happen, we'll try to do that.
Yep, it should be on the bottom of your this is just the classic pandemic Zoom problem. So here we go. It should just say share screen at the bottom of your Zoom.
Yep, it did.
Highlighted.
Obviously I tried it before, so I'm puzzled by that, but let's
I had to go through it a couple of times myself, so maybe just try clicking on it again and maybe we can
Okay, we'll get it.
Yeah.
We'll get it here somewhere or other. Okay, screen share. Let's see.
Definitely want to see all those canopy shots.
I hope so. Yeah. Let's see. Where is it? Okay, so now I've got it, but you don't have it yet, I guess. Do you?
No, if it's helpful, Meg, I can flip through it for you if you prefer to just do that.
Thanks,
That would be
Kevin.
fantastic. Okay, let's do that because it was working great before. Where are we? Do you want to just flip through them all? That would be fantastic. Okay, and if you want to just go ahead and I'll just tell you next, but we saw the kid thing and then we saw the climbing thing, and we can move on and see hopefully the biodiversity stats. And then in this graph, we had the history of arbonauts moving from walkways to cranes to the first walkway in North America to inflatables and all over the world. And then the first public walkway in North America, which I built down here in Florida. And finally leading to the Tree Foundation, which today is the organization that helps build these walkways to give Indigenous people income and hopefully sustainable income instead of logging. And that's what kind of led me to write this book called The Arbornaut. So next, Kevin, we can move on and remind ourselves that trees, of course, are this incredible absolute artery for the world. They provide us with all these essential services while we sleep, and we literally can't survive without trees. Fresh water, oxygen, all sorts of products. They conserve soil through their roots. They house so many species. They now are known to store carbon and help control our climate. And for some 2 billion people, they provide spiritual heritage. So lo and behold, trees are so, so essential. In my book, as well as in my career, I have been so passionate about giving back to girls, because I think in my own case, I never had a mentor that was a living woman. I never had a woman science teacher even. So I think it's important for all of us to try to influence other girls along the treetops journey, in my case, or any other journey that all of you are taking. Next, please. One case study that I'm so grateful to the Explorers Club for is funding me with a flag expedition over there to look at the biodiversity in the last remaining forests of Ethiopia. Like so many countries, there has been an amazing degradation of forests in this beautiful, beautiful country. Less than 4% remains. And you can see here that it's surrounding the churchyard. And that's because the priests believe in saving all of God's creatures, whereas I, as a biologist, believe in saving biodiversity. So next, please. With this unusual partnership of religion and science, I've been able to make some inroads into helping the priests save these last tree plots. And lo and behold, we've been discovering all kinds of amazing species there, including things that provide medicines and important products for Ethiopians. Next. The solution, so simple but really effective, is educating the priests, because none of them have aerial maps or measurements of the distances of the forest or the deforestation, and then building these simple walls which represent removing stones from the fields and helping the farmers keep their cattle out of the forests, and reminding the people where the boundaries of these church forests really exist. Next. Now you can see a beautiful finished product, a very inexpensive solution, but a wonderful one, because these walls were really the idea of the people, not of me. And so local or bottom-up conservation is such an important way to go, I think, for those of us who are part of doing this type of field work. Next, and the challenge here, of course, is how on earth can we control the accelerating rate of deforestation and preserve biodiversity, as well as keep some of these forests intact. And this has plagued me for an entire career, because so often scientists publish data and maps about biodiversity, but we don't really get our hands muddy in terms of the solutions. So the next slide is part of what I'm trying to do to instigate a solution for my beloved forests, and that is to start a new program, which I'm I'm calling Mission Green, that will provide environmental justice for Indigenous people, conservation of the most endangered forests of the world, and education of students who might want to go to these sites and study biodiversity. To do that, I'm building canopy walkways in the 10 most endangered forests. Next, please. And this is based on the ideas of my wonderful friend in the ocean named Sylvia Earle, who has started a similar program, but in the oceans. Her Mission Blue identifies hope spots in the ocean, and my Mission Green identifies hot spots of biodiversity in forests. Next. And so with that, I'm really grateful to Ed Wilson for serving as honorary chair of this group called Mission Green, and his book cites those 10 most endangered forests that I will be focusing on to build these walkways, and hiring local Indigenous women and families to run these ecotourism operations. We've had some really good success already in Malaysia and another one in Peru, and are waiting for COVID to allow us to go into Madagascar to build the next walkway there. Next. Finally, big shout out to a lot of these explorers who have been part of my gang to set this up. And I hope before I go into the ground and become part of the world of the earthworms that I will be able to pull this off. And thanks in a big way to the Explorers Club for so much inspiration to do these kinds of hands-on projects. Next, I think that might be just about it. We'll be working away on Madagascar, on a walkway in the subtropical forests of Florida, and hopefully one to come in India. So with that, I think I will just sign off and turn it over to someone else, since I used a little extra time for that picture problem. So thanks so much, ladies, and on to the next explorer.
Thank you, Meg. I really appreciate what you said about getting our hands muddy in terms of the solutions too. I think sometimes it can be messy and opaque, and doing it anyway and embracing those unknowns is so important. So I'll look forward to getting more into solutions-oriented mindsets after everyone's done presenting. So next up, we have Dr. Julie Kunin. She is an expert on food, culture, and the environment. Her work is dedicated to increasing sustainability in food systems. As an anthropologist, she has worked in international development and biodiversity conservation for 15 years. Most recently, she was a vice president for the Americas at the Wildlife Conservation Society, a nonprofit dedicated to saving wildlife and wild places. Julie, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks so much, Katie. Really great to be in such company. And Meg, I have so much to talk to you about. I'm going to talk about something in my lecture about ritual technology and the relationship between engineering of agriculture systems and the relationship that has with traditional religions and ritual practices. So maybe we can explore a little bit of that in the Q&A. All right, I'm going to start by sharing my screen and just making sure that all the slides are working before I start going down the path of talking. So why don't we just see if that actually works. Can you all see that?
Yep, we can see it.
All right, so now I just display the screen. Let's see if I can get it to actually play. Okay, you're seeing a very colorful basket of potatoes, am I right?
Looks
yes.
great.
Excellent. All right, the hardest part of the lecture is over. So excited to be here. I thought a lot about what I would maybe want to share with this audience. And what I thought I would do with the time that I have is just take a little journey, as Meg has just done, through various sort of iterations of my career, the path of which has definitely been winding. And I think maybe from the outside perspective, and probably certainly to my parents, did not look like it had any logic to it. But when I kind of look back on it after about 20, 25 years, I can see that the theme all along is what we call sustainable gastronomy, which is a fancy and probably more lovable way of saying it's really about the link between food and biodiversity conservation, seen through various different lenses and different sectoral and sort of methodological approaches. So I'm just going to sort of walk through that in the couple minutes that I have. So I started out, as a couple of us on this talk or on this panel did, as an anthropologist, and I specifically focused on Mayan archaeology. So this is me in the field during my PhD research studies in Belize. And then later on in my career, circling back to the same very important Maya forest in Guatemala. And at the time, my research focused on indigenous agriculture systems. And I was specifically looking at the way that complex societies such as the Maya manipulated their natural environment and their natural resources like agricultural soils and water to produce enough food to feed what we now know to have been tens of millions of people in this tropical and fairly challenging environment from a sort of water and soils perspective. So I sort of did a very ivory tower, I will say, sort of approach to my studies, and had every intention of staying in academia throughout my career. And the big sort of takeaway from the research that I did here is the thing that I was commenting to Meg about just on the side there, which is from a non-Western perspective, what people think of as engineering and what people think of as religion are not two different divorced topics. So the integration of engineering interventions that enabled a society like the Maya to manipulate and utilize the resources around them in order to support themselves was in itself a religious and a cultural practice. And it has a huge amount of meaning to them. And that is something that I've carried sort of in my mind as I've gone through and worked in many, many other cultures, in many different societies, and ultimately in many agricultural systems. And I think I should just say that I think a lot of the challenge that we have today in terms of global farming systems and the global food system is that we've forgotten some of those lessons, and we approach things in a purely industrial approach, and we have lost some of that integration and some of that sort of synthesis. So that concept of ritual technology, which is something I learned from one of my professors, the esteemed Steve Lansing, with whom I studied at Arizona, has stayed with me even as I ended up leaving academia. I made the decision to leave academia, and I went to work in international development with a position at USAID, the Agency for International Development. I became the Forestry and Natural Resources Advisor for the Latin America region for aid. And I have to say that in my interview for the position, basically my future boss said to me, well, you lived in a tent in a tropical forest, so you know something about forests. Like, that's good enough. You'll figure out the rest of it. So I sort of showed up on the job and learned very much on the job, putting my academic training into practical use. But a large part of what I did in my role was to work to find ways to provide economic incentives to indigenous and traditional communities stewarding high biodiversity lands throughout the Americas. And some of the ways we did that was to recognize that their farming practices, and what you see on the screen here is a coffee agroforest, had the ability both to provide economic income to them and also to preserve biodiversity. So as the agency, what we tried to do was to support those value chains. And what you see in the lower left is a specialty coffee shop and its owner in Lima, Peru, who recognized both the value of these coffee crops and also their deliciousness and their ability to really be a premium ingredient, a really delicious ingredient that could support these communities and that could ultimately help them steward these forests. So I worked both in the coffee sector. This is a similar type of approach. This is cacao. The former pictures were from Peru. This is in Bolivia. And there are just, innumerable indigenous communities who recognize the riches that they have in their forest, are committed to conserving them, and need some way to do that in a way that, of course, enables them to survive in terms of, economically, and also just in terms of their social well-being. So a large part of what we did was sort of find ways to put links into this chain. It's very rewarding work. There's a lot of interest in these kinds of crops, and I witnessed a lot of the proliferation of things like bird-friendly coffee and fair trade certified and Rainforest Alliance certified and all of these things. And ultimately, there were just a lot of links in this chain. And I think some of the lessons that we learned is that it's technically very difficult. You have really basic logistical challenges like transport, cold storage, volume control, consistency of product. And it just taking a purely sort of economic model to it and trying to just pretend that these things are commodities, just like any other commodity, really does not kind of get us where we needed to be. So I ultimately left USAID and moved to the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is a major New York-based nonprofit. I'm sure folks know it, with headquarters at the Bronx Zoo. And really tried to dive a little bit deeper into this idea that deliciousness is an entry point to engage people in conservation. And that circles back to what I talked about before in terms of sustainable gastronomy, using the deliciousness and the pleasure of a food to engage people who would not normally think about these things in thinking about how their food and drink choices impact the environment and can ultimately either support or help destroy important things like biodiversity conservation. So there's a lot I could say about that, but I'll just snapshot. This is a very busy and colorful slide. This is again from Bolivia. One of the things we did at WCS was launch an initiative called Sabores Silvestres, which basically means like tasty forests in Spanish. And we organized culinary expeditions into the Amazon with leading chefs from renowned urban restaurants in the capital cities of Latin America. So in the bottom left here is my dear friend, Marcia. She is the executive chef of Gustu, which is a renowned restaurant in La Paz, Bolivia. And we did these food festivals basically, and these exchanges where we would meet with communities. We would learn from them about different ingredients and preparations. They would cook for us. We would taste and sample and enjoy. We would then return the favor and cook for them using some of those same ingredients, but in preparations that were more familiar to our urban-based chefs. Ultimately, they brokered some purchasing arrangements and actually bought and arranged for some supply chains. But more importantly, the chefs went home to their cities as ambassadors for this kind of cooking and for the heritage, the gastronomic and the biodiversity and agrobiodiversity heritage of these communities, and translated that onto the plate into a language that urban diners could understand and ultimately celebrate. And so it was this two-way, really interesting exchange of knowledge, and then sort of speaking each sort of different community's language in a way to recruit people who could be champions and supporters of this idea. It was fantastic work. And it led me actually to a desire to work on sustainable food and sustainable gastronomy full time. So I ended up leaving WCS and working as a business consultant and a journalist. And among the projects that I worked on was this one, the Gostos de Amazonia partnership in Brazil, which recruited a cadre of chefs in Rio de Janeiro and in Sao Paulo to experience this beautiful fish, which is paiche in Spanish, or pirarucu in Portuguese. It is a sustainably harvested, community-managed Amazon freshwater fish. It was highly endangered and now is sustainably managed. It is delicious. And we took these chefs into the Amazon to experience it firsthand, to meet with the communities who help manage these fisheries. And then those chefs went home and prepared dishes with these foods to introduce diners, urban diners, to the idea that they could actually make choices that weren't just about salmon and tilapia. So this idea, again, of using deliciousness to sort of translate into a way to bring people into the fold around conservation. Just two more quick stories from me, and then I think, Katie, nod your head in my direction if I'm going grossly over time, because I can't actually tell. But I just have two more things to share with you. I also work and continue to work as a freelance journalist, exploring the topic of food and culture and place through the lens of popular writing, primarily for food magazines. And I've written about sort of just the nexus of these things. How does food express culture? How does it express religion and ritual and social constructs that in anthropology we recognize as things that bond people together as a society? How is the modern food system disrupting that? And what are some of the potential solutions? So this is just a snapshot of a couple of the articles that I've written. And I recognize that the picture of my colleagues is sort of on top of my slides, but there's not much I can do about that right now. But I've explored the indigenous and BIPOC roots of regenerative agriculture, celebrating the fact that this rise in what we're talking about as a kind of post-sustainable approach to agriculture is very much rooted in the traditions of indigenous communities and those of people of color. I've written about changes in academic food studies programs in the ways in which those academic programs are pivoting to address more explicitly issues of social and environmental justice. And the one that's kind of hidden by my friends here is a piece that I wrote looking at the threats to the banana industry as we know it, which is a single species based, a single variety based rather, industrial plantation style of producing bananas. And there is an onslaught of a fungus that is slowly but surely decimating them, and the ways in which researchers and the banana industry itself is going to have to respond, because you heard it here first. In about 10 years, we will not be eating the banana that we all know, the Cavendish banana. It's not going to be with us anymore. We can talk about that more later. And I'm going to end here, which is the work that I do now, which is probably a very strange photo that most people did not expect to see. But my current role is as the Director of Sustainability at Oatly. Oatly is, as I'm hoping people on this call know, a maker of oat milk, one of the many plant-based milks that are on the market these days. And my role is to take the company towards its goal to source 100% of our agricultural ingredients in a regenerative fashion, and to help the world pivot away from animal agriculture as it is practiced today in the big industrial agricultural sense. That kind of agriculture, as my colleagues here know, is responsible for most of the deforestation that we see today and the loss of species and the endangerment of populations. So pivoting to plant-based eating is the #1 thing that people can do to make a positive contribution to biodiversity and to sort of stop this madness of the continuing destruction of forests to grow corn and soy to feed cows that then we eat. So plant-based milk, definitely a great way to go. And I'm loving my work in the private sector, working for a company that really is committed to doing this through the very deliciousness of the products that it offers. So again, coming around full circle to this idea that I think deliciousness is a really important entry point to get people to be more conscious about the choices that they make in their daily lives and the way that they can either be helpful to or harmful to biodiversity. So I will stop there. And thanks so much for the time. I look forward to our later conversations.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's been so cool to see you transition out of your role at WCS and into applying your intelligence and tenacity full force into the food systems. And Julie's a really talented journalist and actually had a feature on the banana saga that she mentioned. Definitely think we'll probably get a couple questions about that. Everybody has to eat, and food is bound up in so much to do with biodiversity. So you're just a wealth of knowledge that will continue to learn from later on. My Family is up next. She is a conservation biologist and a PhD candidate working towards discovering and protecting the planet's biodiversity. She has led several expeditions to Madagascar, where she collected terrestrial jungle leeches to use as a proxy for biodiversity. She is currently a fellow also at the American Museum of Natural History. All right, make us fall in love with leeches, Mai.
That's my job. Okay. Let me just make sure I am sharing my screen correctly. And you just give me the thumbs up when it looks okay on your end.
We got it.
Okay, great. So, right, I'm currently at the tail end of my PhD, and as Katie touched on, I've been using my dissertation to discover and explore this new method using leeches as a proxy for biodiversity, and using the blood in their guts to figure out what lives in the forests that they live in. And so, as all of these extremely impressive presenters have touched on before, biodiversity, or the variety of all life on Earth, is crucial to our food security, to regulating our climate, to keeping our air clean. It helps buffer infectious disease. It's a source for many medical and pharmaceutical advances. And of course, it provides numerous cultural and spiritual benefits to societies all over the world. And so traditionally, scientists and researchers monitor this biodiversity using camera traps, as Katie mentioned earlier, as you can see fastened to this tree, which just takes snapshots of wildlife as it passes through. And more recently, researchers have begun exploring blood-feeding invertebrates as a means to monitor biodiversity. So they've done some research on blood-feeding carrion flies as well as mosquitoes, and also on leeches, which is where my work comes in. And when it comes to leeches, they perform better than flies or mosquitoes because they've been found to preserve host DNA in their guts for longer periods and at higher quality. Also important to note is that they don't have wings, unlike mosquitoes and flies. So relatively, they're very sedentary, and they'll oftentimes reflect the fauna from which they were collected, the forests from which they were collected. Leeches are also extremely abundant and easy to collect. I will note, though, that I don't collect leeches which have fed on humans. And they are found across the Indo-Pacific, which is this region pictured here, which is also a region that harbors many of the world's biodiversity hotspots. So those areas which are extremely ecologically threatened. And perhaps among the most threatened of those hotspots is Madagascar, this island pictured right here. And Madagascar has lost up to 90% of its original forest cover due to logging. About 90% of the species found in Madagascar are found nowhere else. And unfortunately, up to 90% of that unique wildlife relies on those shrinking habitats. However, it's not necessarily all doom and gloom for Madagascar, because every couple of years, researchers are discovering many new species, and several researchers have found that we've in fact vastly underestimated the biodiversity found in Madagascar. And so that makes working there quite special. And I can't emphasize how lucky I feel to be able to do this work in Madagascar, where the sense of wonder is sort of always being reinforced. And so this is sort of how I conduct my work. I camp out in some of the most remote rainforests in the world. I wake with the forest, and I go out and I collect these leeches, pretty much as many as I can process with the available sunlight. And I do that with the help of Malagasy students and researchers who help us navigate the forests. And the students go on to complete graduate degrees, usually master's programs, alongside the work that they do assisting me in the field. I've also, of course, had my fair share of leech bites over the years. And so once I've got my batch of leeches, I take them back to my field lab where I process them and I organize them into different tubes and get them ready to be shipped back to the American Museum of Natural History. And so this is what they look like once they're all done, processed and labeled. And this process, this video you see here, is sort of what that work entails. And so here I'm dissecting part of the GI tract of the leech, which contains the blood meal, which I'm interested in. And I target this area because, as I mentioned, it contains the blood of the hosts of the leech. And I can extract DNA from this region of the leech. And I target specific genes, which will help me identify different taxonomic groups which they fed on. And so this technique overall is known as IDNA, or invertebrate DNA. And it's an offshoot of the more popular eDNA, or an environmental DNA, which is a method that overall targets residual DNA in the environment. So it's typically an extremely non-invasive process. And it helps establish baseline measures for biodiversity, because leeches have been shown to feed on a wide variety of taxa, from snakes and frogs to mammals and birds. I found that they feed on essentially anything that moves. This information has helped such organizations such as the Wildlife Conservation Society verify the presence of certain species out in Cambodia. And it's helped create baseline measures to help prompt the protection of unprotected forests in Madagascar. IDNA has proven to be an extremely complementary tool to traditional surveys, such as camera traps, because oftentimes these leeches will feed on animals that are too small to trigger cameras or too camouflaged to spot even with a trained eye. So they're really showing us a distinct and unique part of the community, and it's proven to be a highly effective way to survey a large swath of various species. And I do have to touch on this other aspect of my work, which involves documenting and classifying the diversity of leeches themselves as understudied organisms. And we do this by doing genetic analyses as well as doing morphological assessments. Now, classically, a morphological assessment would involve a dissection, but as you've seen earlier, these leeches are quite tiny and they're soft-bodied, which makes it really hard to dissect them while preserving that really crucial internal anatomy. So what I've done in my work is used these MicroCT scans, which is just a CT scan as one would go get at your medical provider. And it's basically taking a picture of every slice of the specimen in different dimensions and reassembling them, merging them into a virtual 3D structure. So this helps preserve the integrity of these very unique leeches, because I do end up discovering many species of leeches every time I go out into the field. And it also allows us to investigate this interesting internal morphology, which helps classify them as a whole. And so through my work, I've really developed an appreciation for leeches as a highly diverse group. They're found on nearly every continent. They're found in oceans, rivers, and lakes. They come in all shapes and sizes. Everything you see on this slide here is a leech of some sort. And of course, I've really come to appreciate their contributions to wildlife conservation and to science overall. And so with that, I will leave you here.
Cool, Mai, thank you so much. I think it's so awesome that just from looking at a leech meal, you can tell who else was hanging out around the area. I don't know if we're going to see them as like poster childs per se for like a WWF campaign or anything soon, but I definitely have some more fondness for them. So finally, we have Dr. Paige West. She is an endowed professor of anthropology at Columbia University and Barnard College, and she has worked with Indigenous communities since the 1990s to understand their biodiversity-focused traditions and to help them conserve their cultures, languages, and environments. She is the author and editor of numerous books and the co-founder of 2 conservation-focused NGOs. Paige, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. And it's so exciting to be on this panel with all of these fantastic scholars and activists. I'm going to share my screen, so let me know when we can see it. All good?
Yep, we got you.
All right. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about my research in Papua New Guinea and the kinds of collaborations that I have with my colleagues there. I'm going to start though with a quick land acknowledgement. You know, the Explorers Club, which is a fantastic organization that I've been so honored to be a part of for a while. It's on land that is owned by Lenape people. Lenape people are the sovereign owners of what is now the island of Manhattan. And it's a place that they and their ancestors have taken care of for generations. And so I just wanted to start out with that acknowledgement. Almost everybody here has mentioned partnerships with Indigenous communities and the incredible work that Indigenous people have done globally to protect biodiversity. And the biodiversity that exists today and existed historically on the island of Manhattan, where I live and where the Explorers Club is in part there because of Lenape stewardship. I, as I said, work on the island of New Guinea, which is in Oceania. You can see that in the slide here. In particular, I work in Papua New Guinea, but let's talk about the island of New Guinea for a second. New Guinea is the second largest island in the world. It is an island with lots and lots of biological diversity. I'm not going to throw a lot of numbers out there for you, but it's a very biologically diverse place. It's also a place that humans have lived for a very long time. There have been a couple of big migrations to the island of New Guinea. About 50 to 60,000 years ago was the first human migration to New Guinea. And then about 3,500 years ago, there was a second migration. The reason that I mention these migrations is to tell you that people have been living with biodiversity and fostering biodiversity on this gigantic island for a very long time. So when we think about indigenous communities on the island of New Guinea, we have to think about their lifeways and their ritual practices and really everything about how they see and understand the world being tied to biodiversity. The island of New Guinea also has an incredibly rich colonial history that I don't have time to talk about, but the island is right now bisected by an international border. The western half of the island is West Papua. It's a settler colony of Indonesia. You can Google it to learn more about it or ask me more about it in the Q&A. The eastern half of the island is now Papua New Guinea, which is where I work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it also has a very rich colonial history that I'm happy to answer some questions about. So Papua New Guinea has been an independent state since 1975. This is the first Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, Sir Michael Somare, who we sadly lost in February of this year. Papua New Guinea, the mainland and the islands combined, slightly bigger than California. California has about 36 million residents. Papua New Guinea probably has about 10 million residents right now. Those 10 million people speak over 860 different languages. So in addition to being a mega diversity place in terms of biological diversity, it's a mega diversity place in terms of linguistic diversity. Linguistic diversity in Papua New Guinea maps onto cultural diversity. So when we think about 860 different languages, we really are thinking about 860 different traditions, different kinds of customs and rituals. And so it's just this incredibly diverse place. It's also incredibly interesting because the vast majority of people who live in Papua New Guinea are still deeply connected to the environment. About 75% of the people there rely on horticulture or using marine systems to get their subsistence needs. And about 97% of the land in the country is owned by the indigenous people. I've worked in Papua New Guinea for so long, I don't even want to tell you how long, but for a really long time. This is just to connect to Meg's work. This is a picture that was taken on the mind-blowing canopy crane that is near Madang, the research station there in 2019. It's just an incredible, incredible experience to be in the tops of trees and to see the world from that perspective. So it's an honor to be on this, this call with Meg. But so, you know, I started out as a terrestrial girl. I was really interested in terrestrial systems, ontology, epistemology, and conservation. So what do I mean by that? I was incredibly interested in the question of what happens when there are intersections between indigenous ways of understanding and making knowledge about the world and external ways of understanding and making knowledge about the world. And I wrote a couple of books about that. And I did a really cool thing with some of my colleagues from Papua New Guinea. I started this small NGO where we started to think about what biodiversity conservation could look like if it was actually driven by people from Papua New Guinea. And so that's what we did at the Biological Institute, Papua New Guinea Institute of Biological Research. And that working with those colleagues to found that NGO made me as an anthropologist realize that I didn't want to do business as usual. Many anthropologists do incredible work where they go out into the world. They're kind of single anthropologists who go out there and they do their individual research, and there's not a lot of collaboration. They come back to their universities, they write books. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to collaborate with people in Papua New Guinea, and I wanted to really work towards biodiversity conservation. And so for about the past 15 years, I've really been focusing on collaboration that results in environmental conservation. My collaborator for most of that time has been John IDNA, who you see on the screen in front of you. He's the founder and director of Islands Awareness. He sadly couldn't be here tonight. He lives in New Ireland, Papua New Guinea, where he's from. And so we work in New Ireland province, which is a marine province. It's off the northern coast of the main island of New Guinea. Kind of, if you know that part of the world, it's in the Bismarck archipelago. There are about 150,000 residents. They speak 18 different languages. So again, incredibly diverse in terms of language. So when most people who think about biodiversity think about New Ireland, this is what they think about. They think about marine diversity. John and I wanted to do things a little bit differently with our collaboration. So we did a massive multi-year survey. The things you see on your screen now are the things that people from New Ireland think about when they think about their surroundings. They don't talk about biodiversity. They talk about food security. All of these things, of course, you see on your screen are connected to biodiversity and to the longevity of biodiversity. But these are the things that were identified by the people in New Ireland. And so we really developed the work that we do around these things that people were worried about. People were worried about declining fish stocks. They were worried about resource extraction. They were worried about climate change. They're also worried about the loss of culture, tradition, and local leadership structures. So the number one thing people were worried about with regard to biodiversity was the loss of local livelihoods. You can see from the screen a huge number of people in the Pacific Islands depend on marine biodiversity for their livelihoods. So our work really focuses on that. I'm going to fly through these decolonization slides because I'm running out of time. But we really also in our work start from a decolonial perspective, which I can talk about a little bit more. And we start from this perspective that comes from the people that we work with. And that perspective is that the separation of the terrestrial and the aquatic, that's not something that people there have historically done. If you want to work towards the conservation of marine biodiversity, you have to work towards the conservation of terrestrial biodiversity. And you have to do all of that with a real understanding that all of that nature is tied to culture and all of that is tied up in ritual. When we think about our collaborative process, we foster grounded knowledge and self-determination through listening, mobilizing, and doing active research. So we have a couple of different kinds of work that we do. We do ritual socioecology programs, which is where we have small, what we would call in the United States, protected areas. We have 11 of them. They are community driven. They are designed by the communities. They are really based on this idea of vale, which is a movement away from the very notion of conservation or preservation to really thinking about livelihoods and how people use biodiversity and how that fosters respect for it. One of the things that we've done in those programs is revitalize traditional conservation methods, which I can talk about. We have some really cool fish trap programs. We've also worked with communities to revitalize traditional leadership structures. One of the things that we identified is that lots and lots of Indigenous people across the region really thought that one of the ways to foster or to strengthen a desire to conserve the biophysical surroundings was to really bolster some of the traditional things that were no longer happening because of that colonial period, because of missionization. So we have projects that revitalize traditional leadership structures. Our big one there is called the Maligan Project. Maligan is a kind of cultural complex that takes a human from birth all the way through death when their spirit leaves their body. This is something that has been eroded over the years for various reasons. We have 3 different projects that are working to strengthen this, to really reconnect ritual practice and biological diversity. And we also founded a school, which is more what we would think of here in the United States as a summer camp. And so we bring kids K through 12, and we put kids in classrooms with scientists and with Indigenous elders. And together, the scientists and the Indigenous elders talk about the intersections between Western scientific knowledge and Indigenous scientific knowledge. And when we think about collaboration, we think about collaboration across a range of groups. And we also, and I'll kind of end with this slide, I think this is my last one. One of the things that John and I think about as people who are, he teaches at university, I teach at a university, we really think about the work we do as listening, learning, offering support, facilitating things, and then removing ourselves. I've written about this in my newest book, if you want to take a look at that. And so this is a picture of John and I. Thank you for your time. And you can hit me up with that on Twitter or on Instagram. John is better on Facebook. And so islandsawareness.com PG is his Facebook site. Learn more about our work there. And I'm just excited for the question and answer. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Paige. I think Kevin's going to bring us into a a little room together so we can see each other. I can't wait until we can do this in person someday again. So thank you everybody for bearing with the pandemic style Zoom glitches that seem to be inevitable sometimes. And Paige, thank you so much for touching on the epistemologies. I think a lot about that in terms of, you talked about taking those ways of knowing and bringing them into the way that science is more, traditionally thought of, and sort of status quo science, outlooks. And, we're in a biodiversity crisis. And sometimes I think of it as a crisis of mindset in Western culture too. And it troubles me at times when nature is just seen for its utilitarian value or recreational value. And so these cultures that still have that intimate knowledge of and connection with nature that bears out in their language and culture and tradition it's so fascinating and absolutely important. So excited to hear more from you on that. We do have some specific questions, of course, on the death of the banana and on leech blood as well. But I want to just open it up to the group to start to see if there's any questions among you for each other, that anything that someone brought up that intrigued you that you might want to know more about.
Well, I'd love to ask Julie a question if I could. I love that idea of sustainable gastronomy. I'm always kind of frustrated and wondering, let's take coffee, for example. People love coffee. Why is it that Americans and Europeans can't buy shade-grown coffee? And how important is it that we start to label products a little better? I mean, is there hope at the end of the day for doing something like saving rainforests with the proper purchase of coffee?
I mean, this is a time of like all of our lives where it's really hard to be optimistic about anything, but I'm fairly optimistic about sort of the potential of food to drive some of these changes. And I don't want to keep sounding Pollyanna-ish about because it's delicious, people will get into it. But what I can say is that in my work, and I used to work in coffee specifically, and I've worked with Rainforest Alliance, who certainly tried to pioneer this idea with its rainforest crunch that you could get people to value forests by, producing products out of the forest. I think the challenges to that are mostly technical and not sort of existential. Like there's problems with certification, there's problems with links in the value chain, there's problems with just like technical, it's hard to ferment a bean when it's pouring rain out without having it rot, solar drying, but those things can all be overcome. I think where maybe we need to see some improvement is, there's just we need, I think, more educated consumers, honestly. And I know that's sort of maybe like a lame answer, but I think it's confusing to people that there's all these different labels and certifications and people don't exactly know where to trust. So I think if we can boil it down a little bit and start treating things not as commodities, that's probably the key point, right? Like coffee is not a commodity. Coffee is actually a thing with terroir. It's a thing that has flavor. You could say the same thing about grains. You could say the same thing about a lot of things. I think if we can start to break down that it's just a bulk anonymous commodity and get people to see there's actually variety in here, I think we'll be on a good path.
Thanks. Love to talk later in person someday.
That would be great. And I kind of, if I could, since I've got the microphone, I want to kind of hit back at you or hit the ball back to you, not hit you. But this idea that I was talking about, and I heard it in Paige's talk too, but I'm not surprised about that because I know her work a little bit. I mean, this idea that we've gone down a funky path of sort of separating out science and conservation from ritual and culture and society. I saw that in so much of the work that we all talked about tonight. And your churches in Ethiopia really struck me. I'm just curious to know more about that. And do you see the parallel that I'm seeing and like how you make use of that in your work?
Sure. And I did just have a whole chapter in my new book about that case study because it is so fascinating and amazing. And I still find it a little worrisome because obviously I did go to Ethiopia to study biodiversity. And when I got there, the priest said to me, well, we don't want a list of species. We want to make sure we can save these forests in perpetuity and, help us do that. And then, their practical approach is so different from, I hate to say it, our academic approach and the metrics that we get used to from academia. So I think somewhere along the line, we have to perhaps change the metrics of how we tackle things in our Western jobs, because I don't know any university that would give you a promotion if you told them you saved 1,000 acres of forest, but they'd probably give you a promotion if you said you published a paper about what lives in the forest. So I feel like sometimes we are, maybe missing the forest for the trees, and we really need to rethink what it is that we're trying to do and how we can apply it a little better. So that's kind of my podium here, and thanks for letting me share that. Do you feel the same, all of you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think Mai had touched on the idea of just even having this like sense of wonder. And sometimes I think there's sort of like a hesitancy to embrace that in academic culture, because you have to sort of statistically show things and analyze it. And it's this very rational way, when I think what drew all of us in was what you started out with, Meg, was collecting the snake skins and the peering at things and just becoming, coming into these worlds. And I think that's what is so fascinating to me is, we might have a list of species, but we've only gleaned the surface of what their habits are and what their languages are and what they're doing when we're not looking, or spying on them in creepy ways with our camera traps. So I guess that would be a question for all of you. What are some of the, exciting or surprising discoveries that you've made when you're up in the canopies seeing different insects interact, or things that you might have gotten out of the belly of a leech that told you something that you had no idea you were going to find out about?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting working on leeches in general, because they are so understudied, and that just goes to show you how little we do know about what is out there. And anyone who works in this Indo-Pacific region, I'm sure, can tell you how prevalent these leeches are and just how little people tend to know about them. So it's been really a treat to take a deep dive into their biology and behavior, and try to bring more light to this subject, and offer them up as sort of a helpful tool to help in this biodiversity crisis. But I did have a question for Meg, who I was very excited to hear will be taking her canopy walkway project to Madagascar. And I wanted to know a bit more about what you were thinking of proposing out there, whereabouts in Madagascar. And I also was really interested in hearing from you about how the Malagasy are perceiving this project, what the sort of the initial response to this proposal has been.
Sure, I'd love to mention that quickly. And I have donated a lot to leeches over many decades.
I'm sure.
You will find my blood in one of your DNA studies.
Absolutely, I'm sure.
In the case, as I mentioned before, I'm a real believer in what I call, bottom-up conservation, working with local people. And since I haven't been in every country intimately for all of my life, in this case, I'm working with Pat Wright very closely. And so we'll be using a lot of her contacts in her research area in the Ramanapana National Park. And we have the embassy's permission and the government's permission in the national parks. And we have the engineers lined up that will go and design it, and the fundraising's going on. So as soon as we can get some ability to transport this team over there, we'll be starting to work on that, and details will follow. But again, it's so critical that, we have this team on the ground that will be able to liaise with local people. That is not a country where I myself did extensive work, but I'm very confident that between her and you now, and of course, Peter Raven's part of my group, and Peter's had a lot of botanists on the ground in Madagascar, and Brian Fisher's been over there making food out of ants, and he was one of my staff at the Cal Academy. So I think there's a good team of people that we can rely on. So please promise to talk to me after the show.
Of course, I would be honored.
And someone was asking specifically about the DNA databases that you're using for your work, just like in general for microbiology. Like, how does that function? Can you just kind of take us through it? It's such an interesting tool.
Yeah. So generally, what happens when you're doing sort of a genetic study is you will extract the DNA from your sample. and you'll eventually sequence that DNA to determine sort of what the order of nucleotides is, which is where all that interesting information is stored. And then once you've got those sequences, the best thing you can do with them is deposit them to this public, open source available database to all. And that allows people who do studies like my own to use them as a database. So I basically use my blood meal data as a query against this global open access database. And basically I get hits back to whatever matches. And so a lot of my work really does rely on sort of this global collaborative effort to make these data available. And so I really benefit, and people who do these biodiversity studies really benefit from the sharing of data and keeping that data accessible.
Cool. That's a good breakdown for those of us who do not hang out at the American Natural History Museum. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Julie, because we've gotten a few questions for people who really want to know about this banana thing. So like, yeah, cocktail party version, like what's going on?
I knew if I said that was all anyone was going to ask me about, which is fine.
Yeah.
So in a nutshell, because it's like a book length thing that I could completely get into. So in the time of the Banana Republic, that awful time when basically, Chiquita and Dole and their United Fruit and fellows iterations basically dominated Central America and ran those places almost like, economic colonies. There was a single variety of banana that sort of came to dominate the entire industry. And the advantage that those companies had was that they were totally vertically integrated, right? So they owned the plantations, they owned the shipping lines, they owned, in many cases, the supermarkets. And the easiest thing for them to do was just to ship an extremely uniform banana that was the same size and ripened at the same time always. That banana used to be called the Gros Michel variety of banana. And then it was completely decimated in the early 1900s, around 1930, by a wilt, a fungal wilt called Fusarium, a strain of Fusarium, that just slowly but surely destroyed all of the plantations. So in response to that, the companies scrambled around and went back to their fields and found a variety that was resistant to that strain of the wilt. That is the banana that we eat today. So that is called the Cavendish variety. That's why when you go to the store, unless you're buying a kind of unique variety that's maybe come through a smaller scale shop. I mean, I think we all can picture the Chiquita banana in our head. It all looks exactly the same. That's because it is exactly the same. So these are clonal species, right? They're vegetatively propagated. They are genetically identical. So this is like a global clone of banana. And lo and behold, there's different strains of Fusarium wilt, and a new one is infecting this banana, and it is not immune to it. And so slowly across the planet where we have all these plantations, they're dying. And but what has happened in the meantime is that a lot of the research that used to go into conventional breeding has basically kind of gone by the wayside. The companies don't really invest in it. And it's not, the CG does a bunch of international ag research. There's a little bit of work on bananas, but it's not a main staple crop for many countries, although it is in Africa. So there's not a lot of research. There is no variety waiting in the wings to take its place. So over time, that variety of banana will die. And the attempts to address that have to do with some genetic modification, possibly, some race to do new conventional breeding varieties. And probably the solution that will be the longest lasting is let's stop planting industrial monocultures, and why don't we start planting more biodiverse farms so that if a wilt comes, it doesn't kill everything. So that's kind of the state of knowledge in a overly large coconut shell.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of hard to shed a tear for industrial monoculture, I have to say. Paige, you kind of had to rush through the decolonization that you were touching on at the end of your talk. I'm wondering if you can explain a bit more what this means generally for conservation and what it means to you with your work.
Well, that's a big question. So
it is.
I won't take much time, but I'll say a couple of things. One of them is that, the entire context of conservation emerging both as a corrective to the problem of the loss of biodiversity and all of the things that are causing the losses of biodiversity, those things are both tied to the history of colonialism, right? So conservation, as we know, the wonderful impulse that it is, comes out of a colonial history of people from the global north, mostly going to the global south and seeing what they determined to be loss of biodiversity and deciding that it needed to be helped along to not being lost. And many of the things that are driving the loss of biodiversity have to do with colonial extraction, kind of histories of colonial extraction. And so when we're thinking about decolonization and conservation, we need to think about that dual edge, that conservation itself comes out of a colonial impulse, but also that all of the things that are driving biodiversity loss are connected to these legacies of colonialism. And so I think we just need, as a community that's committed to biodiversity, we need to think about those legacies a little bit more carefully than we have in the past. In terms of the work that John and I do together, we really have thought about decolonization in terms of talking to people in New Ireland about what they think changed during the colonial period and what they think they want to change back. So a really concrete example of that is the fish traps. People really want to revitalize these fish traps. They were pretty much wiped away during the German colonial period. And so working with people on the ground to understand what was lost during the colonial period and working to rebuild some of those traditional practices.
Thank you so much. And I, for one, am excited to read your book. I'm sure there's a lot of that you expand on there, and it looks great. And I think, and thank you for saying some really hard truths too. I know that we kind of started out with that massive flood that was just stat after stat about kind of, these things that are going on right now, and really fostering these like deeply intelligent and thoughtful approaches to like, what are we doing in the first place, is so important. I know for myself with journalism, a lot of what I spend my time on is linking, a lot of the actions of Western corporations and problematic governments to the ecological abuses. And for me, a huge part of this is just starting with telling the truth about what's going on. And so we are getting, quite a few questions also about just the pandemic and how that has affected everyone's field work. Have you all been able to go out? Meg, it seems like you're in Scotland right now. What it's been like to have your world sort of hemmed in, and what are the plans to get back out there?
That is great that you mentioned that. And I was, I guess, it was the third day that the UK was open that I was scheduled to come here. So I really did get in under the wire, and I didn't expect to get here. And I did a lot of research in the Highlands for some of my earlier canopy work. So it was more like a reunion to come back and hug my trees a little bit and spend some time over here with colleagues. To be honest, I know it's affected so many people. It's definitely affected my ability to build the canopy walkway in Madagascar, to bring students and citizen scientists, which I usually do, to the Amazon every July. And so I think we are all holding our breath to get back in the field. It has allowed time to do things like write books, which is great, or perhaps fundraise for wonderful things that we need to do for biodiversity. And I'm just hoping and praying for the sake of students, most of all, that we can get them back in the field, because I'm sure it's really tough for a PhD student who needs to collect field data. I just don't know how you all are surviving, and I'm just hoping that you will, get some benefits along the way. So I'd love to hear back from you all who are these PhD students, how you and your colleagues are faring.
I mean, I've been luckier than most, I have to say. I did collect the last of the data that I needed for my dissertation in December of 2019. So I really just made it out in the very last minute. And I have colleagues who are not as fortunate and, had their field seasons cut short and were stuck abroad and had trouble getting back. And now it's looking like, yeah, some people are going to have to reimagine their entire dissertations to work around the pandemic. So it's a tough situation, definitely.
Oh, gosh.
One of the things that I've seen in Papua New Guinea is that a number of conservation organizations who have worked on all kinds of things have repurposed some of their staff and some of their funding to combat COVID misinformation and to do COVID education. And so I think there's been a real use of the existing infrastructure of small NGOs to do a lot of good work around COVID. And I think that's just important to highlight, because my guess is that's happened all over the world and not just in Papua New Guinea.
And Julie, I think you were hiding out on farms for a little bit during the pandemic. You were out in Montana. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't start out in Montana. So I, at the time when the pandemic really hit in March of 2020, I was in the consulting phase of my iterative career, and a number of the projects that I was meant to do got canceled. Of course, I mean, my consulting was about food, travel, and restaurants. So like, what are the things that fell apart during COVID? Food, travel, and restaurants. I was meant to do that work on Brazilian Pirarucu in person. So I had to do that virtually. An expedition that we had planned to go to Bolivia was also canceled. But you know, those are sort of details, and everybody obviously had experiences like that. But for me, so I found myself stuck in New York when the strict lockdown came, and I don't know, I just thought to myself, you know, I'm a person who works on sustainable food. I opine on it, I advise people on it, I provide technical support on it, I write papers about it. And the one thing I have never done in my career is actually grow it. And when that thought occurred to me, we were at a moment when, you know, the food system in the United States was really fraying, right? And if you guys can all remember, a year ago, farmers were dumping crops in their field because they couldn't get them to market because all of the schools and hospitals and restaurants and resorts had shut down. And at the same time, supermarket shelves were empty and people were hoarding food. So I just sort of thought to myself, well, the path I was on is not open to me right now. I can see an obvious way I can contribute to making a contribution to a healthy local food system and actually physically getting my hands in the dirt. I thought that would be very nourishing and very spiritual. And I just wanted to grow food. So I actually drove across the country during the pandemic, landed in northern Montana, and I worked for 5 months as a farm laborer on an organic farm. I just was like a paid hourly laborer on a farm, and I grew food and I got it to local people, and it was healing. So that's how it affected me. It was life altering.
I remember seeing pictures of your hands, and I think you had pretty much dirt under your fingernails at, you know, every moment of the day. And so I know that
that's a permanent condition.
Lucky you. Meg, we want to let you go to bed pretty soon here. And Paige, return to your family vacation. Thank you to everybody for taking the time to do this. I'm wondering if we could maybe have everybody share a closing thought, perhaps something that is like a next like step or goal in your work. I know this club is like, you know, people are always trying to find ways to support each other. And a lot of people in the audience, Edward says, just want to thank everyone for the important work and finding it very inspiring. So a good time for people to be able to get in touch around things that they might be able to help with. So Mai, do you want to maybe start with what's coming up for you, what your next focus is? Oh, you're on mute.
Of course I am. So I am hopefully wrapping up my PhD in the coming year. I've got all that data collected and I'm working through it now. But as a lot of my fellow colleagues and impressive scientists have touched on, I've really felt and witnessed the disconnect between academia and societies and cultures and actual impact. So I am sort of trying to figure out sort of what the next steps are for me and trying to strike that balance where I'm able to sort of apply my research skills, but in a way that feels a bit more impactful than just publishing papers.
Yep, absolutely. Meg, any closing thoughts?
Sure. I'll leave you with the closing question because we're studying biodiversity here and talking about biodiversity. What is the commonest species in your local forest? And I'm going to hazard a guess because I think a lot of you know that I love and study water bears, which are found in every droplet of water and piece of moss and piece of foliage and bark, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know that for a fact. I've had students work on that, but I throw it out because we still know so little about what lives in our backyards. And that's part of what I write about in my book. I've had students with mobility limitations learning to climb trees thanks to National Science Foundation. I just am very passionate about getting people who may have some kind of, diverse challenge to access field biology, because I think that's important. But I hope all of you will take a child outdoors or a student outdoors and try to think about what is the commonest species in your little neighborhood or your sidewalk crack, because I think everyone needs to pay attention to biodiversity, and it could become some fun project you can do with the young people in your neighborhood.
Absolutely. I find water bears oddly adorable. Anyone who doesn't know them, Google them immediately. And there's this great tool that you can download called Seek by iNaturalist. And it's a wonderful way to just go into your backyard and you take a picture of a plant. It'll tell you exactly what it is and how many other people have also documented in the area. So thank you so much, Meg. Paige, would you like to share a closing thought or something that's up next for you?
Sure. I'll say two things. One, I'll start with saying thank you so much. This was really great to hear about everybody's work, and it's been an honor to be a part of it. So the two things that are kind of on my landscape for the next year, I have a Guggenheim Fellowship to write a book that's a little bit about wonder. It's a little bit about the world around us. It's called Auntie, A Prayer for the World, and it's focused on telling the stories of place, women, and biodiversity. So look out for that. And then also, I have the incredible honor of being part of a group of faculty at Columbia University who are creating a new school there that's focused on climate change. And, it's a school that's going to be, I hope, like nothing else we've ever seen. And one of the things we talk about a lot is this disconnect between the life that we live as scholars and the work that gets done in the world, the kind of work I do, the kind of work everyone here does with small NGOs. And we're really trying to stop that divide between the academy and practical work in the world. So also watch for that, the Columbia Climate School. It's just an honor to be a part of that. And so those are the two things that I'm really focused on right now.
Cool. Thank you so much, Paige. And Julie, we'll kick it off to you for the final word here.
Thanks. I'm actually in the really fortunate position. I have a lot of really fun side projects coming up in my life. So in addition to my primary work at Oatly, which right now is very much focused on working with our Canadian farmers who supply our oats and some of our other agricultural ingredients to make the pivot to regenerative farming systems, which is the bulk of my work right now at Oatly, which is fun and exciting. And hopefully I'll be able to cross the border now and actually meet with people in person. But I have three little side projects that I'll just mention quickly. They're all biodiversity related. One is that I have a new article coming out about ancient grains and heritage wheats. And the differences among them in terms of this myth that we have in the United States that people are gluten intolerant and that ancient grains are somehow less gluten-y, which they're not, but they're delicious and they're artisanal and they have lots of extra nutrients in them and they're good to eat. So that's one project. I just joined the advisory board for a new master's program. Paige made me think of this. I've actually forgotten about it. But I'm an advisor to the Culinary Institute of America. They're developing a new master's program on sustainability and food studies. And so I'll be helping to shape that curriculum and that program, which I'm really excited about for reasons that should be obvious in the talk I gave. And then the last fun project that I've got on my plate is I'm collaborating with my colleagues who formed an artisanal cocktail bitters company, who are all PhD plant scientists who met at the New York Botanical Garden. And we're working with a local distiller in Montana to develop, instead of an Italian style Amaro, which is an Italian botanical infused spirit, we're going to do one that's based on the local ecology and biodiversity of Montana and the Northern Rockies. And to have those like plants and biodiversity and flavors that characterize the mountains where we live actually reflected in the bottle in the spirit that we're going to be creating so that people can access it through the glass. So that's a fun project too. So that's what I've got going on.
Cool. And Julie had
I
actually
figured a cocktail. We could end on
Yeah.
a cocktail, right? Like I had the
Yeah.
final word, so you know, why not?
I'm still disappointed that we all didn't get to. I mean, I remember you designed a cocktail for the Explorers Club Gala. So
We
hopefully in the
did.
future we'll be able to
I
experience that.
know.
So thank you
We
to
had the
all of
best recipe, so hopefully.
thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. And I also want to thank the committee, the Women's 40 committee that made this lecture and all of the rest of the lectures and future ones possible. Especially to Milbury Polk, who is the leader and started this. And I want to say also a personal thank you to another committee member, Catherine Nixon Cook. Both of these women really go out of their way to create opportunities for other women and people in the club, and have made this year a lot more fun for me personally. And I know they've done that for many others. Their leadership style is absolutely incredible, and I have a lot of respect for it. So mark your calendars for a couple upcoming events that I'll just quickly mention. Women of the Ocean exploration is on September 28th. And then this incredible year of women in exploration will culminate in a symposium that will be on November 5th and 6th. That'll be organized and hosted by our committee members. So thank you to our audience for watching, and thank you to all of you for being here at all odd hours of the day. Appreciate it. Goodbye, everyone.